Roosevelt, Astor, Forbes, Cabot, Russell. You see these names chiseled into the granite of university libraries. You see them stamped on the massive endowments of Yale and Harvard. You see them immortalized on the face of Mount Rushmore. You were taught in school that these men were the architects of the American dream, the captains of industry, the visionaries who built this nation through furs, banking, and railroads. You have been lied to. The foundation of America's oldest money isn't innovation. It is narcotics. These dynasties all built their initial fortunes the exact same way, by flooding the Qing dynasty of China with opium. We are not talking about illicit suitcases in a back alley. We are not talking about small-time smuggling. We are talking about state-sponsored drug trafficking on an industrial scale. American fleets, some of the fastest ships ever built, shipping thousands of tons of hard drugs across the Pacific. The economics were staggering, profit margins exceeding 400% per voyage. The cost was millions of addicts, millions of deaths, and the total economic devastation of his civilization. And then they executed the perfect cover-up. For 200 years, these families buried the shipping records, burned the ledgers, and used their blood money to build museums and universities. They rewrote the history books to ensure you never found the source of their wealth. Consider Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who saved America from the Great Depression. The uncomfortable truth is that the fortune which funded his privileged upbringing, his Harvard education, and his entry into politics came directly from selling hard drugs to Chinese addicts. The institutions that educate our leaders and the dynasties that still run this country were capitalized by a crime against humanity. Today we open the financial dossier they tried to destroy. This is the untold story of how America's elite families got rich selling drugs. We begin with the most uncomfortable truth of all. The House of Roosevelt. History remembers FDR as a patrician hero, a traitor to his class who fought for the common man. But the middle name, Delano, is where the money lived. His grandfather, Warren Delano II, was not merely a traitor, he was the chief of operations for Russell and Company, the dominant American opium firm in China. This was not a passive investment. This was hands-on trafficking. In the Panic of 1857, Warren Delano lost the majority of his legitimate fortune in the American stock market crash. He was facing financial ruin. He didn't choose to rebuild it through hard work in New York factories. He explicitly chose to return to China to sell drugs. He wrote home to his family, justifying the trade. In a letter that still exists in archives today, he argued that the opium trade was fair, honorable, and legitimate, comparing the sale of highly addictive narcotics to the importation of wine or brandy. He spent years running operations in the Pearl River Delta, overseeing the smuggling of thousands of chests of opium. When he returned to America, he was wealthier than ever. That opium fortune built the 40-room mansion where FDR's mother grew up. It paid for the tutors. It paid for the sailing trips. Then there is John Jacob Astor. In American folklore, he is the Fur King, the visionary who built a real estate empire in Manhattan. That is a carefully curated half-truth. While Astor traded furs, he realized early on that the economics of the fur trade had a fatal bottleneck: payment. The Chinese didn't want Western goods. They didn't want heavy wools or lumber, but they would pay silver for opium. Astor's ships, like the famous Macedonian, began making regular runs carrying high-grade Turkish opium into Canton. Opium was the financial lever. Astor bought opium cheap in Smyrna, Turkey. He sold it for a premium in China. He extracted silver. He used that silver to corner the global tea and fur markets. By 1840, Astor was worth $20 million, adjusted for inflation and share of GDP. That is billions today. The Waldorf Astoria, the New York Public Library System, the vast real estate holdings in Manhattan. The seed capital for all of it was derived from smuggling narcotics. He wasn't just a landlord. He was an international drug trafficker who laundered his profits into Manhattan soil. The Forbes family, a name synonymous today with capitalism in wealth rankings, follows the same dark pattern. Robert Bennett Forbes and his brother John Murray Forbes made their initial millions as captains and traders for Russell and Company. They were the men on the water, outrunning patrols, delivering the black mud to the coast. But the Forbes family adds a crucial layer to this history: legacy laundering. John Murray Forbes took the massive liquidity generated from opium profits and directed it into the next big American boom: railroads. He became a railroad magnate, dominating the infrastructure of the expanding United States, including the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. This is the Forbes model. Extract wealth from Chinese addicts, wash it through international trade, and embed it into the backbone of American industry. The magazine that celebrates the richest people in America was born from a dynasty that got rich by poisoning the East. We must understand this through a macroeconomic lens. Historians often ask how the United States, a young and developing nation in the 19th century, found the capital to industrialize so quickly. The answer is primitive accumulation. The American Industrial Revolution was thirsty for cash. It needed liquid capital to build factories, lay tracks, and found banks. The opium trade provided this injection. It was seed capital. To grasp the necessity of this dirty money, we must look at the Panic of 1837. The American banking system collapsed. Speculative bubbles burst, banks failed by the hundreds, and paper credit became worthless. The U.S. economy was in freefall. In this vacuum of liquidity, there was only one reliable source of hard cash: the China trade. While legitimate businesses shuttered, the opium fleets kept bringing home silver pesos and bullion. This drug money acted as a de facto bailout for the American Northeast. It stabilized the banks, it allowed payrolls to be met, it kept the lights on in Boston when the rest of the country went dark. The hard truth is that during one of America's worst financial crises, the economy wasn't saved by government intervention or industrial innovation. It was kept on life support by the silver flowing from the veins of Chinese addicts. But the flow of money didn't stop in the North. There is a darker geometric connection here. The Triangle of Doom, the silver extracted from China, didn't just stay in Boston banks. It was used to finance the purchase of cotton from the American South. This created a horrific symbiotic relationship. The profits from addicting the Chinese were used to perpetuate slavery in the Americas. Opium paid for cotton, cotton paid for slaves, and the products of that slave labor were sold back to the British Empire. It was a globalized web of exploitation. The Boston Brahmins liked to pretend they were morally superior to the southern plantation owners, but their ledgers tell a different story. Their financial empire was a bridge between the opium dens of Canton and the slave plantations of Mississippi. To understand the crime, you must first understand the economics. In the early 1800s, the West faced a catastrophic balance of payments crisis. Britain and America were addicted to Chinese luxury goods, consuming massive amounts of tea, silk, and porcelain. But China had zero interest in Western manufacturing. The Qianlong Emperor famously wrote to King George III, saying, "We possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures." This created a massive trade deficit. The Western nations were bleeding their treasury reserves into the Orient. They needed a commodity to reverse the flow of money. They needed a product that the Chinese market couldn't refuse. They found the perfect solution: opium. It was the ultimate financial instrument. It was grown cheaply in British-controlled India or Turkey, refined into a smokable poison, and smuggled into a market where it was strictly illegal. The profit mechanics were simple and devastating. A trader could purchase a chest of opium in India for approximately $100. By the time that chest reached the Chinese coast, the black market price exploded to $500 or $600. That is a 400 to 500% profit margin. In the 1830s, there was no legal industry on Earth that offered returns this high. It outperformed gold mining. It outperformed whaling. The risk was death. Chinese authorities would execute native smugglers if caught, but the rewards for the Americans were astronomical. A single successful voyage could turn a ship captain into a millionaire overnight, and the cycle was self-reinforcing. They sold the drugs for silver. They used the silver to buy tea and silk. They sold the tea and silk in Boston for another profit. It was a triple compounding money machine. But how did American upstarts compete with the mighty British East India Company? They couldn't win on volume, so they won on speed. This is where American engineering entered the crime scene. They built clipper ships. These vessels were the stealth bombers of the 19th century, built specifically for speed. They were sleek, narrow, and heavily sailed. Ships like the Sea Witch or the Anne McKim became legends. They were designed for one purpose: to outrun the clumsy Chinese naval patrols and deliver the cargo before anyone could catch them. But to truly understand the genius of this crime, look at the infrastructure. The Americans didn't just sail ships, they built a floating city outside the Lowell. At the mouth of the Pearl River, anchored off Linton Island, lay the receiving ships. These were not temporary vessels. They were massive, heavily armed floating fortresses, stripped of their masts and permanently moored. They act as offshore warehouses and banks. The American clippers would offload their opium onto these floating depots and immediately turn back to India for another load, maximizing efficiency. The receiving ships were impregnable vaults, guarded by private militias and cannons, holding millions of dollars in silver and narcotics. It was the 19th century equivalent of an unregulated offshore banking haven, a zone where no law existed, where opium was currency, and where the transfer of wealth happened in the shadows, completely invisible to the customs agents on the mainland. This wasn't just trade. It was a sovereign criminal state, operating on the high seas. To operate in this criminal state, the Americans needed local accomplices. They found them in the Hong Merchants, a guild of Chinese traders who held the monopoly on trade with foreigners. The most famous was Hao. At his peak, Hao was arguably the richest man in the world, worth over $26 million in 1830. He was the buffer zone. The American families dined with Hao, traded through Hao, and used his political connections to bribe local officials. It was the ultimate crony capitalism. The Americans provided the product, Hao provided the access, and they split the spoils while the population rotted. This wasn't just a conflict between nations. It was a joint venture between the elites of both countries to exploit the common people. The most terrifying aspect of this wealth is not what it bought, but who it bought. The opium profits didn't just build mansions. They built the very architecture of American power. Look at Yale University. In 1823, Samuel Russell founded Russell and Company. He made an absolute fortune exploiting addiction, but what his family did next changed history. In 1832, his cousin, William Huntington Russell, used that opium wealth to co-found a secret society at Yale, Skull and Bones. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a financial fact. The Russell Trust Association, which funds the society's operations and owns its headquarters. The TIM was endowed with money made from smuggling narcotics. Think about the implications. The secret society that produced 3 U.S. presidents, William Howard Taft, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush, was capitalized by the destruction of Chinese society. The network that has supplied Supreme Court justices, CIA directors, and secretaries of state was birthed in the hull of an opium clipper. The most powerful secret society in America is, at its financial core, a drug cartel legacy. And they had the perfect moral camouflage, the church. This is the chapter of history that makes uncomfortable reading for the pious. Many of these opium voyages carried 2 things: crates of opium below deck and Christian missionaries above deck. Families like the Oliphants, known as Zion's Corner in Canton, refused to trade opium themselves but happily facilitated the system. The missionaries needed passage to China to save souls. The drug lords needed moral cover to destroy bodies. It was an unholy alliance. The opium clippers were the only reliable transport, so the word of God arrived in China on ships reeking of the devil's mud. This symbiotic relationship allowed the elite back in Boston to maintain a facade of religious piety. They could sit in their pews on Sunday, praised as pillars of the community, while their fleets were busy addicting the very people their passengers were trying to convert. The corruption extends far beyond a single secret society. The names of these drug traffickers are plastered across the most prestigious campuses in the world. At Columbia University, the Lowe Memorial Library stands as the campus centerpiece. It was named after Abiel Abbott Lowe, a man who ran clipper ships to China and made millions in the trade. An Ivy League icon built with drug money. At Harvard, you have the Cabot House, named after the Cabot family, Boston Brahmins who were deep in the opium trade. At Yale, the Perkins Fellowship is funded by the fortune of Thomas Perkins, another major opium smuggler who turned philanthropist. This was a calculated strategy of reputation laundering. These men knew their money was dirty. To clean it, they employed a simple transaction. They donated massive sums to universities and hospitals. In exchange, these institutions granted them something money usually can't buy: moral superiority. They transformed themselves from smugglers into philanthropists. They bought their way into heaven. And this brings us to the systematic silence. Why isn't this taught in History 101? Because the donation came with a condition. Forget the source. Go to the FDR Presidential Library today. You will find scant mention of opium. The Delano fortune is euphemistically described as the China trade. It sounds exotic, adventurous, harmless. Visit the museums funded by the Astors. The plaques talk about furs and real estate, erasing the opium entirely. The Forbes family history celebrates railroads and publishing, conveniently omitting the drug running that made it all possible. They didn't just buy buildings, they bought the narrative. They controlled historical foundations and endowments to ensure that the word opium was scrubbed from their biographies. It is the ultimate gaslight. They poisoned a nation, took the money, and then paid historians to call them heroes. While the Forbes and Delaney families were counting profits in New England parlors, the other side of the ledger was being written in blood across the King dynasty. By the 1830s, the product these Americans were shipping had created a humanitarian crisis of biblical proportions. An estimated 10 to 12 million Chinese citizens were addicted to opium. That was roughly 10% of the entire adult male population. This wasn't recreational use. It was societal collapse. Families were destroyed, productivity vanished, but the economic devastation was even more lethal than the drug itself. We call it the silver drain because the Americans demanded payment in silver bullion. China was literally being bled dry of its currency. As silver flowed out to Boston and New York, the value of money within China collapsed. Farmers, who sold their crops for copper coins but had to pay taxes in silver, went bankrupt. The state began to fail. The Delanos and Astors weren't just selling a product. They were systematically extracting the accumulated wealth of a 4,000-year-old civilization and transferring it to their own bank accounts. When the Chinese government finally tried to save itself, sending Commissioner Lin Zexu to confiscate and destroy over 1,000 tons of opium in 1839, the West didn't apologize. Britain declared war. This is where the American narrative usually hides. We like to think the Opium Wars were a British thing, but the United States played the role of the vulture. During the First Opium War, while British ships were engaged in combat, American firms like Russell and Company stayed on the sidelines and quietly took over the trade. They flew the neutral American flag to keep the opium flowing while their British rivals were fighting. The Americans didn't fire the cannonballs, but they happily looted the burning house. When Britain forced China to sign the Treaty of Nanking, opening ports and ceding Hong Kong, the United States immediately rushed in to sign their own unequal treaties, the Treaty of Wang Ya. This treaty, negotiated by Caleb Cushing, introduced the concept that would define Western imperialism: extraterritoriality. It was a legal superpower. It meant that American citizens in China were subject only to American laws, not Chinese laws. If an American trader beat a Chinese coolie to death or was caught smuggling tons of narcotics, he could not be tried by a Chinese judge. He would be tried by an American consul, usually a fellow merchant, who would dismiss the case. This wasn't just a trade agreement, it was a license to commit crime with absolute impunity. It stripped China of its sovereignty and turned the entire country into a lawless frontier for American profiteers. We need to visualize this contrast to understand the modern world. In the mid-19th century, Boston was undergoing a renaissance. The first red brick mansions of Beacon Hill were rising. The endowments of Ivy League universities were swelling. The railroads were connecting the continent. Simultaneously, Canton was burning. Millions were dying in opium dens. The Chinese economy was entering a century of humiliation. This was the largest wealth transfer in human history up to that point. The capital that industrialized America was directly siphoned from the collapse of China. Every time you admire the old architecture of New England, you were looking at Chinese silver that was laundered through American bricks. The golden age of the American elite was paid for by the dark age of the Chinese people. The most bitter irony of this entire saga lies in a single signature. In the 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat in the Oval Office and signed some of the strictest anti-narcotic legislation in American history. He positioned himself as the guardian of public morality, launching the modern war on drugs. Yet the very hand holding the pen was fed, clothed, and educated by the largest drug cartel of the 19th century. This wasn't just a personal contradiction, it was class warfare. The elite families who had secured their fortunes suddenly decided that drug use was no longer a noble trade, but a criminal vice. Why the change of heart? They didn't grow a conscience, they secured their capital. Once the Astors, Delanos, and Perkins families had laundered their opium profits into clean assets like railroads and real estate, they no longer needed the drug trade. In fact, they needed to stop it. They didn't want competition, they wanted to pull up the ladder behind them. But there was another chapter to this efficiency. The ships that carried opium to China did not return empty. They realized that the same vessels could carry a different kind of commodity back to America: human labor. This was the birth of the coolie trade. The very same trading houses that addicted the Chinese population then transported desperate, impoverished Chinese men to California to build the railroads. It was a closed loop of exploitation. They profited from the addiction in Canton, and then they profited from the labor in California. The tracks of the transcontinental railroad were laid by men fleeing the very ruin these families had created. The pivot to prohibition was calculated. As Chinese immigrants began arriving in America to build the railroads funded by opium money, they brought the habit with them. Suddenly, the elite saw a threat. They launched a massive propaganda campaign, painting opium not as the gentleman's trade of their grandfathers, but as a foreign plague. The Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 wasn't just about public health. It was about consolidation of control. They created a legislative wall that criminalized the user while canonizing the dealer. It established a precedent that defines American justice to this day. If you sell drugs on a street corner, you go to prison. If you sell them via a trading company or a pharmaceutical boardroom, you get a library named after you. If this story sounds familiar, it is because the script never changes. Only the actors do. Fast forward to the 1980s. The CIA was implicated in allowing cocaine to flow into American inner cities to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua. The Dark Alliance series by journalist Gary Webb exposed how the government facilitated the crack epidemic for geopolitical gain, destroying black communities just as the opium trade had destroyed Chinese ones. Webb was destroyed professionally for telling the truth, just as history books were rewritten to protect the Delanos. Or look at the opioid crisis of the 21st century. The Sackler family pushed OxyContin, knowing it was addictive, creating millions of junkies to build a multi-billion-dollar empire of art wings and museums. The pattern is identical. Flood a market with addictive substances for massive profit. Use the proceeds to buy respectability. Use the law to punish the victims while the profiteers walk free. The opium fortunes were not an anomaly. They were the prototype. Let's be clear about the final scorecard. The Roosevelts, the Astors, the Forbes. They won. They didn't just escape justice, they dictated it. They kept the money, they consolidated the power, and most impressively, they kept their reputation spotless for over 2 centuries. They successfully transformed from international drug lords into the moral compass of the nation. They say, history is written by the victors. That is true, but financial ledgers do not know how to lie. The records are still there, buried in the archives, whispering the truth that they tried to silence. The most beautiful neoclassical buildings in America, the libraries, the museums, the university halls, stand on foundations mixed with mortar, blood, and opium, so the next time you walk past an Ivy League library, or see a famous last name attached to a billion-dollar philanthropic foundation, ask yourself one question. Where did that money actually come from? And if they were willing to poison a civilization to build their empire then, what are they selling us today? Money has no smell, but history does.